Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for staying with us. I understand that those of you who've been in the room have had a bit of a tour around InsurTech and in the afternoon some slightly more deeply technical issues. We're going to try and keep this panel moving, so we're going to jump straight in because there's a lot to cover. So the subject matter is data in the opt-in economy. We've got a number of vectors of attack here into this discussion. How we secure it, how we make it available. We're going to be talking about the nexus of GDPR and the Second Payment Services Directive. We're going to be talking about how we look after customers when things go wrong as well. So I'm going to start the panel off by turning to Erika from DCMS. The Department of Digital, Culture, Media and Sport.
Excellent, well done.
So I just wanted you maybe to give a little bit of background to the audience on some of the things that have been talked about by way of government policy. We've heard of the Smart Data Review, the Furman Report. Give us a flavour of what's going on in the corridors of power.
Okay, well, I'll try and bring it together. Actually, that's my job. So I've been brought into DCMS, reasonably new recruit, to look at a national data strategy. And the idea for that is to bring all of these different initiatives together. I think government has been running after the tech sectors or digital technology, trying to keep up a little bit, but also trying to get ahead. So as Gavin's just said, we've got the work that's been done on GDPR, which is now embedded, and I think has really been great in terms of helping people to understand how their data can be used and what their rights are. The principles are all there. And then there's been more recent work to look into, well, okay, that's data protection, but what about competition? You know, and how does data protection and competition interact with one another? And those are some of the questions I think we need to answer next. So Furman has come and said, you know, actually, there's a big issue in terms of competition here, and we've been concentrating on data protection. So I think that's the next big piece for us, is to try and look at that regulatory landscape and all of those different imperatives that are on us as a government that we should be thinking about for citizens, and then trying to make some sense of that.
And Erika, on that, I mean, have you been looking at what's been happening in some other markets?
Yeah, so I think you're probably referring to the Smart Data Review that BEIS has been working on. So
and also in places like Australia, they've got this customer data right. In India, they're just about to pass something that enables all the customer to have rights and to share all of their financial data.
Yeah, so I think that the movement to enable, and this is the principle, I think in the last panel they were talking about the difference between the principles and the sort of actual reality. I think the principle is becoming sort of world understood that customers should have the right to their data. I think what isn't world understood is how do you actually make that happen? What needs to be in place beyond the sort of principles and the policies? What are the actual standards that need to be adopted? Who's going to actually suggest which standards they are and how to adopt them? And I think there's a role for government in that, but also there's a role for industry in that, and I think we've got to work together.
And Emma from AccountScore, I mean, you're a CEO of a now global fintech business, which helps people with these forms of access. Can you maybe just explain, you know, from your perspective, PSD2 predates GDPR by about 4 months. Yeah. We get clarity in the liability model in PSD2, but maybe not quite as clear as to who does what in GDPR. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, well, I think as you know, we work very much in the open banking space. We're one of the third-party providers who's an account information service provider. So, throwing my mic around, sorry. So we absolutely had to work through the consent-based model, which I think was founded on looking at the principles of GDPR, because you had to look at GDPR coming in, how the consumer had control of the data, and then how you got explicit consent in the regulatory framework as a third-party provider of open banking data. So open banking has enabled, you know, the first sort of like fully fledged explicit consent platform. But what it also kind of was missing from my point of view, from the regulator, was when the regulator was putting it, embedding what they needed to get it out there so people could apply to be AISPs. They were very much thinking of it from a personal finance manager style solution. So the definition of account information services, and that the consumer has that right to be able to view their data, have complete control over their data, revoke consent, reactivate consent. It's all very, very well-meaning, but in a practical solution, it's actually very challenging to be able to deliver. So where you sit, so we tend to sit in the middle of a lender's journey. So we work with HSBC, for example. So we would sit there as the consent platform, open banking platform, where that consumer gives their consent to share their data with us. But then afterwards, we still have to maintain with the consumer that consumer-facing proposition.
Yeah.
And I think that's something that's very, very different, but I think it's something that...
Did you get your AIS license?
Yes.
So
we were one of the first 10.
Perhaps you could just give the audience a sort of 30-second overview, if you can, of what you had to go through and be as an entity to be viewed by the Financial Conduct Authority as an appropriate party to get access to this data.
Yeah, and it wasn't easy, right? I'm very much from a lending background historically, so was used to getting regulatory permissions. And actually, when we had the information through from the FCA, we thought, okay, this is not going to be too bad. It's a registration, so we'll get that in, and it would be relatively straightforward. And actually, the piece where they were quite rightly super hot on us was all in around information security, because albeit that they will say that the bank transaction data is not personally sensitive information, it's incredibly powerful. And if it was to fall into the wrong hands, that would be a real problem. So we were approved as one of the first 10 through, but I would say that the area that they came back and questioned time and time again and were super rigorous on was all in around the system architecture and how that you could ensure you had as much as you could have in place on the cybersecurity elements.
So turning to Andersen, clearly you're from what I would describe as a deep security background with all the things you've done, military-grade security, and your business model is all about trying to protect those resources. When you're thinking about supporting organizations that wish to be recipients of data and custodians, is there any thoughts that you want to share with us about best practice and how that happens in the modern economy?
To me, it's actually very simple, and no one can deny that logic. Is if you don't know what's going on, then even if someone tries to hack you, there's nothing to hack. So for our systems architecture, we've spent a long time. In fact, one fundamental assumption is we have to assume someone might hack us one day, or through an insider. When I say insider, it doesn't mean someone malicious. An earlier speaker was talking about planting some guys in your software company to do it. But most of the time, when we see breaches, is mostly our most loyal insiders who might have got the same way of doing things time after time, month after month, and they're the most vulnerable. So if people want to do advanced persistent threats and all these attacks, they are the ones that people would target. So, but if you set your company up to do a number of things, first of all, we don't do any data mining because I trained as a computer auditor like 30 years ago. I knew how powerful this kind of data merging, slicing, dicing, and whatever. And I knew a lot of these problems would arise one day, and in fact, it's cyber Armageddon now. So the one fundamental principle is, if you decide not to data mine, then it opens up another perspective altogether. Then when you come to do your protection, put in your controls, it's entirely different. So one thing I practice the most is segregation of duties to make sure no one can see the complete picture.
One of the challenges, though, when you take that approach into financial services context is that any company that is involved in the distribution or advice on financial services has to keep records. One of the things, going back to Emma's business model is helping companies make, for example, lending decisions. You can't play a role in that and not record what the customer looked like at the point of the decision.
Absolutely. We're required to keep that data for 5 years as a minimum, right, by the
Yes.
regulator.
But obviously, you still have to find methods to protect it. And you said something I really admire when I hear it from the security industry is that, everything, you can put up the best defenses, but everything at some point will have vulnerabilities when the hackers catch up. So if we were to start from the position that, something may go wrong, and we do everything we can, and when you went through your permission with the regulator, you had to show you had taken what was viewed by the regulator as adequate precautions. I noted, though, in PSD2, there was also a requirement for you to hold what would be, in the modern economy, known as cyber risk insurance. You had to get an insurance policy in place. The thing, going back to Andersen for a second, to just query that, how do you assess any market model where many providers may hold the same data? Which firm it was that got hacked? Is there any method of looking at the audit or the security history or the pen tests, or how do you assess if nobody puts their hand up and says, it was us that lost the data? Because at the end of the day, I don't know of any insurance policy anywhere that pays out unless liability is established. So if we're going to move into this market where assets are insured, how do we make sure that the insurer pays out at the right time? How do we deal with these things?
Okay, I have my very specific opinions on that. It might be a bit controversial.
No, please. We don't mind controversy here, do we?
Okay, but let me just clarify. There might have been a confusion. When I said I didn't want to see the data, I didn't mean I didn't want to have or the need to possess the data. It's just like it's encrypted in so many different ways because that's our business. All kinds of cryptography. Like today, throughout the day, people will be talking about homomorphic, threshold, public key, and all these. We use all of that to make sure we cannot see the data. But when the user and the banks and all these, when they need to access data, then there would be channels and secure tunnels for them to see it. So we're just a mere custodian of encrypted stuff. Okay, just to answer your question on insurance payout, I've dealt with a number of very large insurance companies in the world. They all offer cyber insurance policies. And I can tell you, when the time comes, when you need to make a claim, most of the policies will not pay out. Honestly.
No, I don't disagree.
Because
you have to establish liability.
I was challenging, this was like one of the top 5 insurers in the world. I was challenging the head of cyber risk and head of fin crime. I said, well, this is an eventuality that everyone will need to make a claim because we will all get hacked one day. And I said, look, if you read our small print, we won't be responsible for that. The claimant will have the proof they have done every single thing correctly, and no one can claim that in the world. So there will be lots of legal cases going forward.
So what I want to see is a market where the customer is protected and we build everything around the customer protection. Obviously, the security, the processes. But we talked just coming in, Philip. I mean, you run a business in the technical and security domain. We talked about things like how we affect those customer protections when data becomes combined. So we know the first stage is that there's raw data and the raw data is shared, and it's very easy to say when the raw data is hacked that data was that customer's data. But what happens when the data is stitched together and at what point does the data become not the customer's data? And how do we protect that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a really good question. And actually going to sort of Emma's point earlier, I think it seems that sort of in terms of the regulations and the policies that are being applied now, they're much more stringent on the entrance to the market as opposed to the incumbents. So if you look at the organisations who are providing the data, they're not having to go through the same stringent checks that obviously Emma had to in order to get this license, and yet they're the holder of the master record of the data. So I think we have kind of 2 scenarios here. We have kind of the historic, which was what needs to be tidied up, and then we have kind of the future state, which is kind of where obviously the fintechs are coming in. And I think, looking at the data itself, you've really got to look at the data and the purpose for its use. And once you start aggregating that data, oftentimes the purpose for use is kind of lost. So it's I may have given consent to use this data to use open banking, but actually I haven't given consent for you to now use it in this particular marketing way. And I think kind of trying to understand the use of the data once it's been aggregated is very, very difficult, and assigning blame is even more difficult. But you can still often kind of reverse engineer some of this data to actually find particular individuals, critical or personal information. I think it's where you can aggregate, you can also kind of unaggregate at the same kind of level.
So it seems, just kind of opening the conversation up a little bit, so we've got the establishment that the customer can share all of their data, financial or otherwise, and they have rights in their data established by GDPR. And yet, in terms of the structure of how the data would be shared, only through payments data have we reached. So I would describe that as, if we were to look at it logically, as a stepping stone to what might come next. And it'd be logical if you had payments data, like your current account, that you might then add a savings account, and you might add maybe loans or mortgages, or investments or pensions, or retail insurance, because the customer might want to have a full view of their financial life. And many of the applications that are in the market today use all of those data assets. So do you think there's any chance of the, Erika, of the government policy thinking about creating a cohesive customer experience for those things? Maybe the same liability model, and the same test that Emma's just gone through for payments to be applied to the other things. Because I would have thought if you were a company that had shown you were a fit and proper actor to hold current account data, then savings account data or mortgage data would be no different. Maybe you could.
So I think it is incumbent upon us. I was actually just thinking, as other panelists were speaking, that one of the roles of government is to also talk to the consumer agencies and think about how this plays out for the consumer. So, I'm learning lots here, and thinking about, well, if you're in a position where if you take out insurance, but in fact that insurance is not very useful, then that's something that I think we need to be thinking through with the consumer agencies, and thinking about how do we actually make these things really work. So I think we're talking a lot about principles, and all those principles are things that we don't disagree with, but we haven't thought through how that then plays out in all those different markets. So I think you're right, government's role is to make sure that it's consistent across markets. I think it needs to be proportionate across markets. So we were talking earlier about, this is the gold standard with banking, because it is the gold standard of your information set,
Sure.
in effect. And so, this is a great place to start. And in the smart data review that's been looking at how you can use consumer data across different markets, open banking is sort of held up as being the epitome. But do you need the same levels of security? Yes, it needs to look the same, otherwise I think it's really difficult for the consumer. But do you need the same levels of security for something like water data? I don't know. I think that those are the conversations that we need to be having. It's true that the regulatory landscape, I think, needs to be looked at again in a data space, and I don't think that's been done. So I think it's happening now with the FCA, but they are a first mover. It's not necessarily happening in some of these other markets where we're aspiring. Has Ofgem done that? Well, they're beginning to, and they're looking at things like my data, so not really for this audience, but they're beginning to. It's quite a different beast.
But where PSD2 says that when you have the data, and if you're the incumbent provider known in the market as the ASPSP, but anyone not familiar with PSD2, we can just call it the bank. When the bank has landed the data and it's now at rest in the fintech, that's a key word, at rest. So it's actually got where it's supposed to go, and it's landed in the regulated actor that the customer has opted into. Right? This debate's about opting in, right? So they've opted in to share the data with that party. That party is going to have put in place those insurances and those protections, it would be a bit weird for the customer if they had to opt in different ways for different verticals, I think. And it'd be a bit weird if when they complained to that actor that has loans, mortgages, electricity data, all, water data, if they had to have a dispute resolution in 10 different directions. I mean, that's the kind of cohesion the market's looking for.
That's right, and I think there's been a debate that is ongoing around whether there should be each sector regulator should understand how data has changed its market, or whether there should be some overarching regulator that understands how data is changing the whole set of markets. So in terms of your opt-in question, I think ideally everybody should know how to opt in, and it should look the same in every place, because that's the beginnings of, forget the thing that you tick box because you want to get to the next stage. Actually, those understandings should be inherent, just as you walk down the high street. In the old days, you would have gone down the high street and you would have probably gone to the bank that your father went to because you knew the bank manager and he was a good guy. You should know that ticking that box is all good guys, right? Because it's all the same stuff and you should be able to understand it. That's the kind of evolution of GDPR that I think is in the hands of government. Whether it means that you opt in once and then that's moved through, maybe what you have to begin to understand is just because you went to the bank down your high street, that doesn't mean that you're going to go to the baker. Maybe that's not the same thing. So you have complex opt-in arrangements.
I think what you're talking about is that transfer of trust. I mean, and that's really what the consumer is looking for. It's, can I now trust the organisation that I'm dealing with? And for us, certainly in the space where we exist, it's the trust is generated through transparency, where the consumer can understand very simply where their data is going, who has access to it, and what purpose are they using it for? Are they using it for purely operational reasons, or are they using it for marketing, or are they reselling it on to someone else to generate a passive income stream? Exactly, and I think it all has to play together nicely. But I think from a consumer perspective, simple and transparent is what everyone wants. But it's a really difficult journey when you've got the large retail banks, especially, who have had 30 years of systems that have sort of cobbled together, and now you say apply a consent model across the top, which is impossible because they have mainframes, they have systems which are third party, which they can't change. So then you're you're creating a landscape which is almost impossible for them to manage in an efficient way. So it really needs to be more about, not so much about sort of the policy, but it's about the implementation. How do we actually make this something which is viable going forward? Because going forward is obviously where we need to get to, I think, is the key thing.
I completely agree. Consent is definitely not something that's going away globally, right? So it's about how do we really implement that, and it's about earning that consumer's trust and not taking it for granted. But in practical terms, how do you make it usable for that consumer? It doesn't take very long for somebody to share their data 30, 40 or 50 times. And as it stands today, a lot of those, that means that the consumer really has no idea who they've shared their data with, on what terms, or have that control over it. So really, I think a very strong benchmark is how the open banking standards are applied, how it's informed consent. And just going back to a point that Erika made, really, where you talk about, where we talk about sort of, earning trust and the education, and it should become second nature. I look at, and obviously the previous panel, they were talking about, mums and passwords. I look at my Instagram-obsessed younger sister, who has no idea of the value of her data at all and would be sharing it around willy-nilly, just because she's done a selfie and wants to be a Kardashian. So, I think there's all of those elements that, you get to a certain point, you understand the value of your data, but actually, where is that responsibility to start educating sooner?
Do you use algorithms in your business?
Yeah. Of course.
Of course, I know.
Of course.
I knew the answer to the question. So, did you get asked about that in your regulatory application?
No.
Did you get any understanding or framework provided to you by regulators about the ethical use of algorithms when you're combining data sets?
No. So and that's where I think with the regulation, we were actually, the way our business is actually set up, you've got your third-party provider as an AISP, which had to be clear. You've got to have this consumer-facing element to that, no matter what you do as a third-party provider. And then we have our other business, which is all of the data and analytics on top of that. So obviously we disclose full transparency to the regulator that consents online and account score work together, and this is how it is all done. But there's nothing, we have income verification scorecards, rent and mortgage scorecards to be able to pick out so that the lenders can actually make decisions in real time. But at no point were we questioned on any of those. It was all in around how the structure would work for a consumer-facing proposition.
I think you raise a really good point there. Is with a lot of sort of what's going on with the move towards AI, it's being able to prove at a point in time the decision that was made by the AI. How do we validate that against a set of data that this is the reason why the decision was made? Because I think just allowing sort of AI to make decisions and not being able to back them up when maybe 3 years down the line the regulator comes and says, well, this is the insurance policies you sold based off this algorithm. Why was that the case? I think you've got to have that transparency there.
And how did you create a framework that prevented discrimination and bias?
Exactly.
How did you prevent it? And I think there's a conversation that has to be had about not just with technologists or lawyers, but with society about what we think is acceptable. Yeah. Which, as we get better and better in getting the informed consent from the customer about how we use the data, we need to equally get better at creating frameworks that help the regulators understand what good looks like. Because we can make these algorithms do anything, right? They can. I mean, Andersen, you're obviously, with your background, no stranger to how algorithms work. Is it? Do you think it's going to be possible in the future for regulators to come back and look at what the black box did 3 years before and work back to what the machine learning, how you trained the machine to make those decisions? Is that possible?
I actually have a global solution to this problem.
Oh dear.
You outsource the whole thing to Facebook. They are the best data analytics firm combined with Google in the world. They will solve all the government's problems. But that also highlights how much data we're actually donating. I actually coined the phrase, in fact phrases like primary, secondary, tertiary. Primary is what I, as a user, I donate. And then when they come to mine what I have on stuff I have not donated, they will look at my friends and relatives and so on to build up a picture, a profile of me. And then the tertiary is like we're totally unconnected. We're sitting here today. We had not met before today. But within seconds, they will be able to map out our relationship, why we're here, because of certain attributes, of certain speciality that we're here today. I know we had the ex-director of GCHQ here. I worked with that organization before. And I don't know whether people have watched this Enemy of the State movie like 20 years ago. That's before I went into cybersecurity deeply. I was bitterly disappointed when I saw the reality. It wasn't as glamorous. It was actually very boring. A lot of desk job and looking at screens and analyzing stuff rather than, what's his name, the actor running around with Gene Hackman.
Oh, yeah?
Nothing like that. Now, in terms of algorithms, for what we do now, we're building this identity as a service utility. So we're giving the end user the self-sovereignty. So that end user will control what goes in, what goes to different banks. So for that, we don't need to use any algorithms. So it's only when we come to use analytics, do analytics when we have, when you look for strange behaviors. So that's another topic altogether. But in terms of pure protection, if you apply certain rules, analytics is actually less important. But when you actually need to build up a different profile to assess that person's creditworthiness or KYC and all these, then that's when it comes into play. But we mustn't muddle the two because they are quite distinct.
So if we were to take the starting point for everything here and said, okay, we put the customer in the middle and we build out all the things that go around them safely being able to share their data. Because we've already reasonably showed that when they do share data and they do it in the right way, it can lead to life-changing improvements in their situation.
Gives them the value, yeah.
Gives them value.
Absolutely.
But where before PSD2 or before GDPR here, particularly PSD2, it was a free-for-all. I mean, nobody checked whether or not you were a fit or proper company to have it. So we've now that we've argued that there's value in this, we've also got the regulation, we've got the liability model, we've got the right not only to give the data but to take it back. One thing we don't have a right to take back though is the record keeping of the financial institution that sold your product. You've already said, Emma, you had to keep it for 5 years. Is there any? I'm mindful of the time. We've got a few minutes left. So what I wanted to do was just to come down the panel. I'm going to start with Erika and come down. If there was one thing that you could put in place that led to an even balance between the rights of the customer in sharing their data and improving their protections and how they, in this new opt-in economy, what would you go for? What would your main thing be that you think might help?
So I think I might land on what you've just touched on very lightly, which is explainability, and that's what's really needed. So with the algorithms, I think it's really interesting. It's like we suddenly made up ethics, right? Ethics has existed for the whole of the time that humanity has existed, the discussion of ethics. And the ethics that we know and like are the same ethics. We just need to think about how to apply them here. But one of the things that we need to think about is explainability of algorithms, but also explainability of systems. So if I was to put something in place, it would be, yes, we need to move really quickly and we need to get these systems up and running, but I think we need to spend some time with consumers helping them understand what these systems are and what's changing.
Thank you. Andersen, the same question to you. What one thing would you go for if you wanted to make a real dent in the universe?
It will be a huge dent. I want to reverse the entire dynamics, and I've been thinking about it for a long time. I think it's totally feasible because talking about 20 years ago, data used to be an asset. Everyone wanted data. A few years back now, data is a liability because of all the regulations. I think now people are starting to talk about self-sovereignty. I think data now belongs to us as the users. If there's only one thing I want to create, I want all these everyday people to be on equal footing when they compete against those social media companies. I want to build a class action factory. So, because there are so many data breaches that you guys are not aware of yet, when they come out, you will have millions of people who have suffered this one, that one, and if we have a systematic process to go after those big companies.
But if that led to a situation where I wasn't able to say my friends' photographs, that's a bad outcome, right?
Sorry, you're not?
Well, if you shut down Facebook because you bring huge class action suits against them, does that not mean that I no longer enjoy Facebook?
Well, there's a choice. People have to decide. There will always be people who have suffered breaches who want to sue, but there will continue. There will continue to be people who want to donate their photos, whatever. So,
well, before I let you off this subject, what price privacy? How do you quantify it?
Okay.
I mean, in some markets, they've already come up with a case that if you suffer this type of breach, it equals so many dollars.
Okay.
We've not done that.
Yeah, there was an analysis done about 5 years ago. They worked out like each person's ID is worth about £1,800, about $2,500 at those exchange rate. Then I think that's way underestimated. It's worth a lot more because they can sell you time after time. If you go to the dark world, we all have a price list. On our credit card, whether it's less than 50 cents, or they can go up to $50 for a black card. So
yeah, but if my medical records were disclosed via my bank data or my gambling habit or something, there might be more. I mean, there might be embarrassment or other things that isn't about selling the data. Anyway, we don't have time to dwell on that too much. Emma.
Really, for me, it's a solution that gives simplicity across the board. So I look at sort of the whole sort of data for me piece, as I call it, where you've said the consumer has that control over their data now. And if there can be a simple solution that empowers that consumer so they're able to get value from services, then that's what I want there to be.
Okay. And global standards?
Ideally, yes.
Yeah.
The UK has absolutely led the way in regulation. doesn't mean it was perfect. And so the countries that are to follow with open banking have the opportunity to go one step better than we've done.
And do it better here. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Philip, you get to sum up then.
Get to go sum up. So I mean, I think really two of those kind of really sort of stuck in my head. I think, understanding is key. So, understanding the data we have and the, what we're going to use it for. But then having a really simple way of being able to actually get that understanding. So I can see the relationships that exist. So it's not just, Facebook, we can easily see the relationships that exist. These are my friends, this is my family, we have that ability to see relationships. But what we need is a way to see, okay, so this is me, this is my relationship to my data, this is my data's relationship to my bank, this is my data's relationship to my health insurer, this is to my, to my insurer, this is to my water company. Having a simple way to have that transparency so that we can understand the relationships, for me that's basically what we've built our company to create, is something that is able to give that transparency and understanding really easily. And I think that's the key. It's got to be simple. It's got to be understandable for everyone. It's not just about kind of the young kids. It's also about the grandparents. It's got to be simple across the estate. So,
thank you. Well, ladies and gentlemen, I hope you've enjoyed our panel on data and the opt-in economy. I think the panel has done a very good job at covering a lot of bases, so I'd like you to thank them in the usual way.